Welcome, everyone, to tonight's Living New Deal webinar, Whose Stories? Exploring the Legacy of the Federal Writers Project. I'm Sue Rubenstein DeMacy, a National Research Associate at the Living New Deal. The Living New Deal is a nonprofit organization founded at UC Berkeley about a dozen years ago. Our mission is to preserve the New Deal's legacy nationwide, to make people aware of what the New Deal accomplished, and to promote a new New Deal today. Tonight's webinar is part of a series of free online programs exploring those topics. The Living New Deal documents the physical legacy of the New Deal in cities, towns, and rural areas across the country when our government put people to work building post offices, city halls, parks, schools, libraries, roads, bridges, and so on. It also left us with a treasure trove of public artworks. This legacy also includes the Federal Writers Project, which we'll be talking about tonight. From 1935 through 1943, the Federal Writers Project, the FWP, or the project as we'll probably call it tonight, put thousands of unemployed writers and others to work, documenting American life during the Great Depression. It produced hundreds of publications, notably a series of state and city guidebooks, oral histories, and ethnic studies. By creating the nation's first self-portrait, the project also sparked ongoing discussions about the documentation of history and the power to determine which historical narratives are told. My contribution to the field was writing the biography of Henry Alsberg, who directed the project from 1935 to 1939, and he was known as the guiding light of the project. And tonight I'm speaking with David Taylor, writer and producer of a new podcast called The People's Recorder. The podcast uses interviews and recordings of people interviewed by FWP writers during the Great Depression. David also co-produced the 2009 documentary about the Writers Project, Soul of a People Writing America's Story. And before we get underway, as Elizabeth said, I just want to invite the audience to feel free to join the conversation later by writing your questions into the Q&A, and David and I will answer them at the end of our discussion. So, hi, David.
Hi, Sue.
Hi. So we've been discussing various aspects of the project recently and for a few years already. And I think you have some interesting things to tell us about the podcast and other things.
Oh, thanks. Yeah, and I have some questions for you as we go along. So yeah,
cool.
Thanks. I'll share my screen. But yeah, it's an honor to be with you here tonight, and thanks to the Living New Deal folks for everything. So yes, I will put this on. I think you can see that now.
Mm-hmm. I see
So
it.
yes, I'm a freelance writer, long time, rather than a historian by training. So I came to the Writers Project with a sympathy for the field workers, the writers who weren't planners or managers. Most came from joblessness and approached their work with all the uncertainty of a freelance gig. And I've had the good fortune to write about the Writers Project for many years, starting with a Smithsonian article 20 years ago, and then the book and film that you mentioned, Sue, Soul of a People, and the film was directed by Andrea Kalin. As you know, there's been a resurgence of interest and research on the project. Last year, Sue and I participated in a symposium on the Writers Project hosted by the Library of Congress and the American Folklife Center. Oral historian Alessandro Portelli gave the keynote, and he called the Writers Project a great listening project. And that really struck a chord for me, that during the Depression, this agency basically listened to American lives and to stories. You may have experienced that in listening to the recordings in the webinar in this series. A few months ago, there were the music recordings from California by Sidney Robertson, one of the people who worked with the Writers Project and other New Deal projects, who actually took equipment out and recorded people's songs and stories And in Catherine Kirst's words, they were the what people were singing in the streets. We hear some of those songs also in the new podcast that Sue mentioned that I've been working with Andrea Kalin's team at Spark Media. It's about the Writers Project and its far-reaching legacy, and we've had great support from the National Endowment for the Humanities and a number of state humanities councils to make the first season of the series. And we're excited to have recently announced another NEH grant to do another season. So we really feel this is a great opportunity to hear from this listening project that Portelli mentioned. Sue did a great Living New Deal webinar in 2021 about the Writers Project and its national director, Henry Alsberg, based on her wonderful book about him. And I recommend that everyone revisit that webinar, which you find on the Living New Deal website. So today I'll start actually from that as a jumping off point. I won't retell in detail the chronology of the project, but I'd like to drill down to share some illustrative stories of what people did on the project, both for the WPA guidebooks and for the practice of life histories, what we now call oral history, which then was kind of under the term folklore, which was more common at that point. As Sue mentioned, the podcast is called The People's Recorder, which you see there, and the host is Chris Haley, whose photo you also see. He's a historian, writer, and archivist at the Maryland State Archives. He's been interested in history and his family's history for since he was a kid. He's also the nephew of Alex Haley, author of Roots. So Chris is really just the person to lead us through the story, and it's been really great working with him, putting the series together. And with advisors, including you, Sue, who's been a great sounding boards for which narratives we reflect, particularly in season one. We're looking at kind of the range across the country of the field workers, and then as we go further in with another season, we'll get more into the national dynamics and hear even more about Henry Alsberg's vision and how kind of the interplay with the field that he saw. We launched a few months ago, and so we're halfway through the first season. And so please take out your phone, type in People's Recorder, and sign up. You can get alerts. You can catch up on episodes that we've already released and get alerts to new episodes as each one drops. And we'd love to hear from you. So in the Great Depression, the publishing sector of the economy shrank by about a third, like it has again in recent years. And that was just obviously a part of the national economic collapse. FDR and Harry Hopkins, here you see his jobs program coordinator, focused on short-term jobs creation. To start with, the Works Progress Administration, WPA, started with jobs initially for public infrastructure. And it was only after unions protested in the streets did creative industries get added to the WPA. Congress even questioned the value of doing that. And Hopkins replied, well, they have to eat like everyone else. So the rationale was for the government to provide work relief, that paying work could sustain people's morale and employable skills better than direct welfare could. So Henry Alsberg had high-level support, but he needed political cover. So he focused his staff on producing travel guidebooks, histories and ethnic studies, but particularly the guidebooks were things that were seen as kind of economically driven. They could support tourism, they could support a recovery, and they would present, as Sue mentioned, America to itself. They could be a first self-portrait in the form of travel guides that combined history and a way to get around in these both walking tours and driving tours. And one of the key people in that process was Catherine Kellogg, who, seen here with them, she helped to shape and edit the guidebooks and especially the tours. And we'll come back to both of them later in this talk. I described my first encounter with a WPA guidebook in a blog post for the Living New Deal last month. It was the New Orleans City Guide. Many years ago, I was starting a cross-country trip with my wife, and a friend gave us a copy of the New Orleans City Guide. It was a paperback reprint, but it was so old. I mean, I didn't think that this was going to be useful when we got to New Orleans, but we got to the city, and I started reading the essays that are in the front part of the book. There's the essay on economic and social development, and then there were the tours in the back half of the book. And my inner history geek got fascinated. I mean, it was, for example, in the upper left, you see we're talking about where the New Orleans cemeteries led to modern garden furniture, and these unexpected connections. So here we say cast iron benches were placed in front of family tombs so that the bereaved might rest while they mourned. Only at a much later date were these employed as garden furniture, and even today they're still called cemetery benches. So that was intriguing. Then in the section on cemeteries, going through St. Louis 1, this page really gets into what the city was like. In other histories, you might hear about the yellow fever and cholera epidemics of the 1800s. This essay gets into the effect of the epidemics on people's wages, on how people were living, and what the scenes were like. You get $5 an hour was failed to hire enough grave diggers. So I just really got caught up. And then you see the illustrations for example, the French Quarter Tour talks about you can walk the French Quarter Tour. So that was my introduction to the series, and I think a lot of people got caught up in the decades after the Writers' Project in a similar way. In making the film, a lot of the historians we talked to, Douglas Brinkley and others, and journalists had used the guidebooks in their travels, just for pleasure. Alsberg's approach as a playwright and journalist, he was interested in how reading and writing represented the world to people, and the guidebooks were an opportunity for that. And life history interviews conducted by the staff would come under the folklore director, Benjamin Botkin for the most part, and his predecessor, folklorist and musicologist, John Lomax. So they really helped lay the groundwork for the practice of oral history gathering that in our time became popular with efforts like StoryCorps. Out in the States, of course, where the writers worked, the work looked different. The jobs didn't have kind of the gloss of creating something out of nothing. It was not like getting a grant from the National Endowment for the Arts, which emerged later under former New Dealer Lyndon Johnson. In fact, 9 out of 10 WPA writers had to prove they had no rent money, no job prospects. And then once they got a job, it was a limited time frame often, and there was a lot of bureaucracy to deal with. But in those offices, sometimes innovations bubbled up, and I think that's something that we don't always hear about when we read about the project. Like in Florida, where Zora Neale Hurston had deep experience to gather folklore, interviews, and history. Alsberg and his team responded to these initiatives, these proposals, sometimes refining them, sometimes embracing new directions. But there was give and take. In the podcast, we hear individual stories from within the Writers' Project and from people today on how those recordings and life stories sound now. The project, as Sue mentioned, raises questions about who gets to record history and whose stories get told. And the recent research is actually helping to illuminate that even more. Alsberg hired for Black history Sterling Brown, Howard University professor and poet, to guide a national series of books on Black American life and history. And this would go ahead alongside the state guidebooks effort. So the first was set to be in Virginia. Um, Sterling Brown had colleagues who were active in Virginia, and after there was local pushback just getting a budget for the effort at the state level, but an all African American unit was hired to create a book called The Negro in Virginia. So it was about a dozen Black staff spread across the state, and they would research for the text that would capture Black history in Virginia from 1619 on, from first arrival. And they pushed their editors up the chain to show the stark inequalities that were still in Virginia. The text would note things like that Black children had for playgrounds only vacant lots or alleys. And then there was a number of WPA photographers who, including Robert McNeil, who took this photo of boys playing ball in a dusty field. And that kind of reinforced the text calling for better facilities. Just a side note, McNeil also was a Howard University alum. He went on to a distinguished career in photography and exhibited widely, and his WPA photos are now at MoMA. So the Negro Studies Unit in Virginia also set out to find survivors of slavery and interview them. They conducted some 300 interviews and recorded sessions like the one seen here. You see, adjusting the microphone, Roscoe Lewis, who led the unit. He was also a Howard University grad. He was a professor of chemistry at Hampton Institute, an HBCU in Southern Virginia. And this, even the recording session, was an innovation proposed by one of the interviewers, Susie R.C. Bird, who lived and worked in Petersburg, where this enclave of survivors of slavery lived. So the value of across the South, actually, the Writers Project recorded several thousand interviews with the formerly enslaved. In many states, the value of those interviews were compromised by the bias of white interviewers. But in Virginia and in Florida, where most of the interviewers were Black, they got more candid accounts of slavery's horrors. Catherine Stewart writes about this in Long Past Slavery. This archive of history of slavery as experienced is like the largest archive of firsthand accounts in existence. And while it's qualified, it is so valuable. It's priceless. In Florida, we follow Zora Neale Hurston's experience, where despite Jim Crow segregation, she found a way to harness the power of the Library of Congress itself. It's state-of-the-art recording equipment that she managed to borrow for ethnographic interviews and take that equipment into a context that she was familiar with, Black communities of the Gulf Coast, and record people there singing the songs that they knew, and then create an enduring record. So I'll play just a short clip from this early episode of the podcast. Years ago, just before he passed at 97, we interviewed Stetson Kennedy, a white folklorist and writer who worked with Hurston. He was just in his 20s, but he remembered their recording tour very clearly. And he described going into rural turpentine camps and recording people there. I'll just play that clip now.
The business of recording stories at work camps was a dangerous one. Camp owners were wary of outsiders poking around and asking too many questions.
It was like entering a foreign country. You know, you had to get almost a visa to get into a turpentine camp. We told the camp operator that we were interested in collecting plantation songs and spirituals and so forth. So he thought that was okay, and otherwise anyone trespassing is, could be shot.
At the isolated camp in the deep woods, Hurston's crew asked turpentine worker James Griffin to tell the story behind his song, Worked All Summer Long. Griffin was imprisoned 3 months at hard labor in a county prison camp. His crime? He was a few days late paying the rent that the company charged workers for their shacks. From the heartache of injustice, Griffin made up a blues. Listen closely, and you can hear a young Stetson Kennedy inviting Griffin to share his personal anthem.
All right. We all sang it out there when I started singing, which that would be my theme song. Well, we would appreciate it very much now if you go ahead and sing it just as you all sang it then. Okay. Well, my dear mother, she prayed this prayer for me. My dear mother, she prayed this prayer for me. She says, Lord, have mercy on my son, wherever he may be.
These recordings at Cross City documented a form of slavery that continued out of public view. More than 70 years.
So that is the actual recording, now from 1939, now in the Library of Congress collection of James Griffin, and it resonates so much now. And we also hear in that episode from Florida historian Tamika Hobbs and folklorist Peggy Bulger about oral history and these lives and communities in Florida now, and how that works. At last year's Library of Congress Symposium, a lively cohort of young researchers reflected the resurgence of interest in oral history and its creative offshoots. Most of the presenters had contributed essays to a new book, Rewriting America, new essays on the Federal Writers Project. And that was edited by Sarah Rutkowski. The papers ranged from one on the COVID-19 Writers Project, centered in Brooklyn and its roots in the FWP, to Noreen Rivera's research on the work of Latino folklorist Aurora Lucero White in New Mexico. And one researcher at the symposium, Maiku Mine, had flown in from Japan just for the symposium. And her essay in Rewriting America considered the WPA's influence for Ernest Gaines when he wrote his novel, The Autobiography of Miss Jane Pittman. And it's just a lot of this work looked at the longer cultural sort of legacy. And so it's a great opportunity to capture that. In a Q&A session, actually, Maiko asked, why did Americans find it so important to record each other's stories? And her question was kind of a good chance to step back and consider the FWP in a bigger context. Was the idea of this listening project of one person's story worth including in a national history? Was that unique to the United States? There was a lot of experience for Ralph Ellison, another subject of the research that we talked about. The Writers Project was a needed job, and an education in art and empathy. On the New York City staff, he had a variety of assignments, including research on the city's history, and he conducted street interviews in Harlem. Ellison was seeing that the local history and American history and Black history were all bound up together. He was seeing the Great Migration before it was an established thing. Oral history for him cemented that understanding, and he drew on that experience in his masterpiece novel, Invisible Man, basically tracing that experience of the Great Migration. The project had that effect of connecting many young writers to this material. And that's what Alsberg expressed, the desire to connect writers with American life and with each other. The large majority of the project writers were white, and really just under 3% were African-American. Alsberg and his staff at headquarters pushed for more participation from underrepresented groups. But hiring was at the at the state level, and where a lot of local and political bias really made that, they ignored that mandate. But in larger cities like Chicago and New York, you had relatively more diverse staffing and creative cross-pollination. So in Chicago, for example, Margaret Walker, we see here, faked her age. She was actually only 20, just out of Northwestern, to get a spot on the Writers Project. And really in the first few days there, she met her cohort that were important for her life development as a writer. She went on to be an important novelist and poet and teacher of another generation of Black writers, from Nikki Giovanni to Alice Walker, relation, and others. But she met Richard Wright, she met Arna Bontemps, she met Nelson Algren, and it's fascinating as patchy as the hiring was. Mary Emma Graham, a literary historian, has said that the impact of the WPA on Black writing in the 20th century was really greater than that of even the Harlem Renaissance, because of the numbers on a national scale and the connections that it created. One example of those connections is this postcard from Nelson Algren to his friend Richard Wright a couple of years after they worked together. It's a made-up government form. Basically, Algren typed up this form as a way to congratulate his friend on a flurry of awards. So he's got the spaces for Story Magazine Award, for O. Henry Memorial Award, for Guggenheim, and he's kind of teasing me. It's like against the background of their shared, origins in this government cogs, dealing with all these forms. He's sort of marking the progress that his friend and fellow writers made. The People's Recorder also features lesser known stories. Alsberg had an interest in Native American history. In many states, however, that local officials failed to hire Native writers or even get their community's participation in presenting their parts of the guidebooks. But there were exceptions in Wisconsin. One graduate student at the University of Wisconsin wanted to document the Oneida language. And that led to another innovation, and in time, really a lineage of historians rooted in the Writers Project, who had been Oneida members of that staff and recorded stories of their elders in their language. Oscar Archiquette was one of those who became fascinated with their history and inspired others in the community with this process of firsthand history. And he, including two of the ones he inspired, were Gordon McCluster and Loretta Metoxen, who was an Oneida historian. We interviewed both of them years ago. Gordon did WPA-style interviews on video in the 1990s. And I loved hearing his passion for that work and how he referenced the WPA as its inspiration. He passed on a value for history and humor to many in the next generation, including a young man he coached named Charlie Hill, who would go on to become a comedian. And so I wanted to play another short clip from this episode, which will come out next week, about that experience.
I'd like to introduce now a new talent on the show, Mr. Charlie Hill. Please welcome him.
Hi, how are you? Hi, how are you? Hi, how are you? Hi, how are you? My name is Charlie Hill. I'm Oneida. I'm from Wisconsin. It's part of your coronation. My people are from Wisconsin. We used to be from New York. We had a little real estate problem.
In the fall of 1977, comedy legend Richard Pryor showcased the young and potentially provocative comedian Charlie Hill on his show. With television cameras beaming his performance across the nation, a nervous yet determined Hill used the canvas of history to share his truth, becoming the first Native comedian ever to perform on national television.
I usually have problems doing my act, because I know a lot of you white people never seen an Indian do stand-up comedy before, Like for so long, you probably thought that Indians never had a sense of humor, you know? We never thought you were too funny either.
It was a groundbreaking moment in television history. But what most people don't know is that Charlie Hill's act, his ability to share the Oneida story with comedy, was a link in a chain that led all the way back to the Great Depression and to a young man named Oscar Archiquette. Archiquette was also a member of the Oneida Nation, or Oneoto'aga, which means people of the Standing Stone, a branch of the Iroquois in Wisconsin. In early 1939, Archiquette picked up a pencil and began to write down his life story in a spiral notebook. He wrote frankly about the ups and downs of his life. Here, read by Oneida lawyer and activist Jerry Hill.
I was born at a time when raspberries blossomed. My father's parents came from Oneida Castle, New York. My grandmother was a daughter of a chief. By 1920, I was on the bum. In February 1939, I was transferred to the Oneida Language Project. It is through this training that I'm able to write my own language.
Archiquette was one of a dozen Oneida who wrote their stories down in the notebooks. The assignment was for the Oneida Language Project, a part of the Federal Writers Project.
I was one of the first to be contacted by
And so that's we're connecting this the experience of the United members of the FWP, which didn't get a lot of play at the time, but they're the WPA notebooks, the notebooks of histories and stories that they gathered, were rediscovered in the 90s, and they're used in schools in Oneida now. And then that connection to cultural history with Charlie Hill just felt great to be able to capture. Michelle Danforth
I'd like to introduce now.
Anderson is an Oneida filmmaker and documentarian. She couldn't join us tonight. They're preparing for their 50th annual gathering, but she worked with those Oneida historians and talks about them in the episode, which is coming out very soon. She and others, make clear that the links from the WPA history to today are we don't always see them, but they're there. This quote from Sterling Harjo about the effect of Charlie Hill's performance is part of that. Episodes later in the summer will share the story from the West Coast. A few examples. Of course, just a reminder that the Golden Gate Bridge was still a work in progress for much of the Depression. And this is a painting from the Federal Art Project. In California, a few examples include Harry Parch, seen at the top photo. It's a kind of a publicity photo for the California guidebooks work. He is known now as an avant-garde composer, but he wrote beautifully, and he considered himself a storyteller in music, documenting not just the music of the West Coast, but also the hobo experience. He worked as an editor on the California and Arizona WPA guides, between stints writing freights as a hobo, among the 500,000 who were riding the rails every year. Tilly Olson was an activist writer from the start. She was one of the leftists that some in Congress claimed had taken over the FWP. She came from Nebraska to California from a Jewish immigrant family. She reported for papers from the historic longshoreman strike in 1934. And then she spent a short time on the Writers Project. And it was, decades later, she had a greater impact after being banned from jobs during the McCarthy years. She became really a champion for women's and immigrant stories through her fiction in her own right, and through her nonfiction also. The third person you see here, Eluard McDaniel, rode freights and basically ran away from home out of segregated Mississippi and landed in San Francisco. His memoir essay about his travels and the discrimination he faced on the road was chosen by Henry Alsberg for the book of creative work by FWP writers, American Stuff. In the introduction, Alsberg carefully emphasized that those stories, essays, and poems were done outside of work hours. He also selected art some prints from the Federal Art Project to kind of intersperse with the writing in the book. Mine Okubo was not a writer at first. She was a rising artist with the Federal Art Project. She was working on WPA murals with Diego Rivera in San Francisco. She was painting American history when Pearl Harbor was bombed. And her family was abruptly detained in camps along with 10,000 other Japanese Americans. And they weren't allowed to take photos of their experience. They weren't allowed to. They had very censored exchanges with their correspondence. But she sketched their experiences there and wrote about them in a 1946 book, Citizen 13660. That's the number that the government assigned her and a brother instead of their family name. That book, as you see, it kind of prefigures the graphic novel form or the graphic memoir in the intimate and inside view of that experience. It's a classic, and that will be better known. There's a great exhibit of her work traveling to museums now, and it shows how I think how the WPA Arts projects, by fostering a personal view of American history, affected how those who worked on them approached their creative life afterwards and the culture. I mean, multiply these experiences by hundreds and thousands. Some writers, project staff became famous National Book Award winners like Nelson Algren. Saul Bellow won the Nobel Prize for Literature. Others gained national fame. Others were regional writers who wrote or local histories. They had a more subtle influence. But beyond the individual lives, there was also the cultural shifts. And I talk a little bit briefly about some of that. Autofiction wasn't a term in the 1930s, but you see in the works of some of the folklore unit, they sometimes snuck in things as a life history interview, proto-autofiction, you might call it, from the writer's own background. So Jim Thompson on the right had studied folklore with Ben Botkin in Nebraska. And he channeled his father, Big Jim Thompson, in a supposed interview with an oil drilling contractor. Thompson was on the WPA guidebook staff in Oklahoma. He later wrote pulp crime novels and Hollywood screenplays, working with Stanley Kubrick on a noir film, The Killing, and many of his books were made into films after his death, including The Grifters. And here he is with one of his co-workers, Louis L'Amour, who became one of the most prolific authors of Westerns in publishing history. So the two worked together. They were dramatically different personalities, and they drove each other a little crazy. In Georgia, another example of this is Chinese American poet Gerald Chan-Sieg. She's the woman in the front left. She chose her name Gerald, knowing it was a boy's name, but that gave her sort of a certain power. She wrote her father's life in a similar way in an essay titled Laundryman. James Sun wrote about Chan-Sieg in Rewriting America and presented her story last year at the symposium. And what it shows about the Asian American stories that are still in the archive that are yet to be really fully explored. So these are examples of the influence of the Federal Writers Project. Narratively, we get into them in more depth in the podcast, but they suggest something that really was Alsberg's vision, in that it lasted much longer than the immediate support which the project gave to people to get through hard times, even though that was vitally important at the time. But it has had a cultural afterlife, and that's changed even how we see history, how we see social movements, and how we record them. So presenting these stories now, at this point, gives us a way to explore issues that resonate from that time: social divisions, inequality, censorship, experiences of race. In their stories, we hear how many lessons and many issues that Americans grappled with in the 30s are still very much with us. So for many years afterwards, the alumni of the original project felt probably a little stifled, given the McCarthy era uh, questioning of any loyalty and how the project was kind of was tainted. But 40 years later, at a panel, Ralph Ellison was speaking about it at the New York Public Library, and I'll just like to give him a word here about what the project accomplished.
Say a word in favor of the collections of regional and ethnic histories, folk say and so on, which was published during the under WPA. Let's face it, Lionel, there is something called official history. Perhaps it's only academic, but you couldn't find the truth about my background in that history. You could not find the truth about other ethnic groups. That's why we have something called revisionism. You didn't even have the truth about white Southern history. And white Southern historians are beginning to tell the truth. Let's face it, we are a country which improvises. We project images of ourselves and work toward it and away from it. The greatest, of course, is the Constitution.
I love that quote. Just, we work towards it and away from it. And yeah, he just... and you hear in his voice in the way you don't necessarily see in the text that his kind of frustration with the limits of what's been said so far, and that's one reason why I think presenting the audio as much as possible and coming out in the podcast is very satisfying. I hope this gives a
word and
there we go. I hope this gives a taste of the Writers Project and its many voices. Please check out the People's Recorder to hear more, as well as Sue's book and webinar on Henry Ellsberg and Scott Borchert's Republic of Detours. At this point, Sue and I will trade a few questions while you put your comments and questions in the Q&A, so please put that in. But first, Sue, if it's all right, I'd like to ask you one or two questions to fill in some of the history that I kind of glossed a little bit. I wonder, just one is, let's stop sharing, I think we can, is to tell us a little bit about, at the start of the project, or the start of the WPA, how was it that protests did kind of lead to the creation of Federal One, the different arts projects? What was the kind of the time frame or the dynamics there?
Okay. Well, the Writers Project and Federal One, which encompassed all of the arts projects, the music, the Federal Theater Project, Federal Art and Federal Writers Project, they all came about in 1935. But before that, there were these smaller efforts to hire unemployed writers, and actually artists and other people in a few states. And that was sponsored by FERA, which is the Federal Emergency Relief Administration, and the Civil Works Administration. So this was before the WPA itself was established. And that led professional writers groups like the newspaper guilds, the Authors Guild, a writers union, the Unemployed Writers Association to lobby the government. And they wanted to create a national jobs program for writers, just like the government had jobs program for people doing public works projects, buildings, roads, hospitals, parks. The groups petitioned the government, and in 1935, as you showed that slide, they started picketing in New York City. And it really didn't take that long for the government to pay attention, the WPA people. Many of the WPA people were simpatico, so we saw that slide. So as they developed blueprints for the WPA projects, the writers were at that point on the radar. And Harry Hopkins, you talked about him before, our WPA director, he believed in relief for out of work writers, actors, musicians, and artists. And, there was that, hell, they've got to eat just like other people too quote that's kind of famous among people who studied the Federal Writers Project.
Yeah, and
And
I guess maybe briefly, just why was Henry Alsberg kind of suited to lead the project?
okay, he came to the FWP. He was 54 years old. He had worked in so many different places, diplomatic service. He did relief work in Eastern Europe. He helped found an international group to aid political prisoners. He was a theater producer at the Provincetown Playhouse, and they focused on sometimes radical ideas like racism and homosexuality. For then, they were radical ideas to focus theater on. He was a foreign correspondent in Bolshevik Russia. He was an editor in newspapers and books, and he was involved with progressive politics, and he had friends in all of those circles. So he could move between bohemian world of writers and artists and the bureaucracy of Washington. He was an idealist. And by 1935, he was a rebel who needed another cause, and his passions were social justice and writing, and they came together under one roof, the FWP. And he wasn't flawless. He was running this, probably the biggest publishing house ever, maybe, it seems like, if you think about it. And it was a new entity, and it was in the process of evolving and being created, even as they were doing it. Over 4 years, they were constantly evolving. There was no guide, so to speak, no map. But he hired good assistants and administrators, and he was a writer who understood the creative needs of the writers. And he was so devoted, like all of the people, not all of them, but the administrators were so devoted, the writers were so devoted, it became almost religious. And I think for people like us who have stumbled upon this amazing thing, it almost becomes the same kind of thing. It's like addictive. When I first learned about it by accident, just looking around the websites, and I found it on the Library of Congress. I'm like, what's this? I've never heard of this. And 90 years later, here we are talking about it, and new books and symposiums and all sorts of things are happening. And I am checking the time because we do have a few questions, but I could answer another one. Or I did want to ask you, why did you choose the format of the podcast? I mean, I liked it. I loved hearing the voices of the past. It really brings it home.
Yeah, that's what I felt too. We talked about it. So Andrea and James Mirabello, a fellow producer on the series, and I talked about, well, what would be a good format for drawing on material, like a lot of the interviews we filmed for the documentary. We had more than we could use in the film, and we thought, well, if there's a series, really, I mean, there was the audio there. There was so much of the recordings in the American Folklife Center that still haven't been digitized, a lot of things. So there's a lot that's on their website, but a lot more hasn't been digitized. But there's, so that really gets at the texture from audio that you get of that time and of the voices. And then since then, we have it. So, in the legacy of people like the Ellison recording from the 80s, when he talked about the legacy of the FWP for them. I think they were just hearing the voices, and then it just resonated with with people like Portelli saying it was a listening part. It was listening to people. So why don't we listen to that now? And the podcast format seemed like one that was flexible enough in terms of how we could structure the episodes and seasons to kind of fit the stories that we have and really pull them together.
Oh, that's great. And by the way, that was a great gift for you, the New Orleans guide. And it reminds me of John Steinbeck's Travels with Charlie. So John Steinbeck was not a writer on the project, but he used the American guides to travel around, and that was in the 60s.
Right.
So it's
right.
So
yeah,
that was a very cool gift.
It was perfect for me to discover them at the place.
Yeah, yeah. I'm just looking to see what time it is and if we should go to the questions yet.
Yeah, should we go to a couple of the questions there
Sure,
now,
let's do
or?
that. I see the first one is, who should be credited with the idea of the FWP as creating, quote, a self-portrait of American language? Is it Alsberg? I always saw the quote as from him. but I wondered if it
That's
was
what,
more of
yeah.
like a PR thing, like a promotional material. I don't know.
Yeah, yeah,
I don't
I'd
know
seen
if you,
him quoted in articles about that too, but then, yeah, they did just sort of work up press releases that he would, be speaking from. So, yeah, that's an interesting
right, yeah,
question.
so he would, yeah, okay. The second question is,
Yeah,
um,
about Who's Who in the Zoo, the book at
who's who? Yeah, that's a
Leila
great one.
Carson's elbow in the photo. Um, yeah,
That was in New York,
the New York City.
the Writers Project of New York City did that, right?
I think that's right. Yeah, and I
Yeah,
don't know whether
yeah,
that was like proposed by the city office or whether that was one that was an idea that came down from the national office. But
yeah, I'm not sure, but it's in a lot of photos and people have heard, that's great that this person who asked the question heard of it. And there are a
I
lot of
grew up with it.
WPA
Yeah, yeah, yeah.
and grew up with it, right? There are a lot of children's books that are digitized from the FWP. And I think it's Broward Public Library, maybe if you Google it,
That's right. Yeah, I
right?
think
And they're
there's that,
digitized.
and there's the Lowinger Library. I think of has a lot of the PDFs of the guidebooks
Right,
themselves, which
right.
are of course also in the public domain. So
Right,
it's
and then specifically with the kids' books, there's tons of them, and so much in your presentation, not so much, but there were a few things that I didn't know, and I feel like, oh, I know so much about it, and there's always new things that come up for me, that card that Ralph Ellison did, or was it? No, it was for Ralph Ellison,
oh
the fake.
the Nelson Algren
Yeah,
one
yeah,
that
yeah,
sent
yeah, yeah,
to
that was,
Richard
I
Wright.
had
Yeah,
never seen that, so that was good.
yeah.
Okay, let's see, we
There's
have
a
another one.
Yeah, did any of the
Um,
notable African American authors you mentioned participate in the collection of former slave oral histories? Well, actually, Hurston's work before the FWP partly served as a template for it. Her ethnographic, for example, she had interviewed the last survivor of the uh, Clotinda in the book, her book Barracoon, which has been republished, finally published. Um, she kind of modeled that ethnographic work, but as far as I know, during the Writers Project, none of them were working uh, on particularly the former slave interviews. Hurston was working on parts of the guidebook, and she did the recording tour that she mapped out, but I don't believe any of the ones she was recording the living culture along the coast, but I don't know that she interviewed any former slaves then. There was one of the interviewers, Viola Muse. Her work in Florida has just been digitized and made available through an NEH grant. So I guess there's an opportunity also to talk about how some of the very famous authors then were inspired by those oral histories, like Toni Morrison drew on them, was responded to them in a way in Song of Solomon, and James McBride. Actually, we interviewed him for the documentary, and he speaks to it in the podcast about research for the Good Lord Bird. He of course knew of them beforehand, and he went through them, and he gained things from it. He really admired the generation of Black writers who were working on that.
I call all of these things that you discover jewels, that the writers have discovered, it's like treasures. And looking at when I was looking at the life histories, I couldn't stop. It's just, there was so many, and they were just, most of them was so interesting.
Yeah, yeah.
I see a
There's so
question
many.
that I would like to answer. It says, was there a hard stop of the various WPA projects, or did they fade more slowly? With World War II looming, did FDR's administration decide they couldn't be a priority anymore? Well, I'll talk about the Writers Project itself. WPA is big. The Writers Project, the Federal Writers Project, was actually officially 1935 to 39, and Congress, House Un-American Activities Committee and Congress, they went after the Writers Project and the Theater Project. and they cut the funding to both, largely because they said, they were all communists, so they cut the funding to the Writers Project and the theater project. And then when Henry Alsberg was fired in 1939, it kind of morphed into a smaller program. It was called the Writers Program, and it was partially funded by states, but not all states participated. So it was kind of shrinking. It did kind of fade out, but certain people like Catherine Kellogg, who David talked about, stayed there until the very end. I mean, she was there literally till the lights went out, but it did kind of fade away.
I guess the
So,
one thing to mention is that, yeah, it was sort of the states, a lot of the states did choose to participate. They had to basically fund like 3 to 1. I mean, the federal government would kind of pitch in 1/4 of the amount to get the remaining state guidebooks and city guides out, get them published. So the states felt there was important enough work to actually to do that, so that a lot of them did. A lot of the guidebooks did still come out in after that 39 timeframe, up until 1941. The last one to come out was, I believe, Oklahoma, just like weeks before Pearl Harbor. So it did sort of dribble out, but it showed a commitment from the ones who, despite the cut in federal funding, there was a lot of appetite to get them done.
right, and they had them kind of in the pipeline, and they worked hard to get them out. There's a question for you about part 2 of Recorder.
Yeah, Al Stein. Yeah, thanks for the question. Yeah, the season 2 will further explore the connections and legacies, as well as within the time, what was happening. So we'll continue the drama of going towards this dramatic, the investigations by HUAC and its role as kind of precursor to the McCarthy investigations in the late 40s and 50s. So yeah, we will continue looking at those connections and legacies. Thanks.
Actually, it reminds me, have you gotten feedback about the podcast?
We've gotten good feedback so far. Have been good reviews. The Washington Post called it a fascinating podcast, and people are rating it well, and we're hearing good things. So it's encouraging that from what we hear so far.
Okay, good.
Yeah.
And I wanted to point out there's a couple of things happening that somebody from the Living New Deal told me about at Stanford University Libraries. Now through January, there's an exhibit called The New Deal and the Federal Writers Project, and it includes some of the 2000 Writers Project and WPA publications that were donated by someone to Stanford. And I think that might be, if you live near there, might be great. And there's a new book I just saw on my Google alerts about the Federal Theater Project, and it is called The Playbook. And I think it just came out last month. So those might be things to look into. So let's see if they're...
Yeah. And of course, yeah, please do check out the podcast. Another episode, the one featuring the Oneida stories will come out next week. peoplesrecorder.info, or just search in anywhere you get your podcast, People's Recorder.
Okay, I think we're coming towards the end here. And thank you. This was a fun discussion, great discussion. Best of luck on the continued success of the podcast. I'll be listening, as I have been, and I hope other people who are here tonight will also. And thanks to the audience for joining us. We're thrilled to be able to present programs like this to share the history and accomplishments of the New Deal. You can learn more at livingnewdeal.org, where you can also sign up to receive our newsletter, updates, and invitations to programs like this. We hope you will. Your donations make our work and programs like this available to everyone. And thank you again for tuning in.
Thanks, Sue.
Thank you.